everyone, and welcome to What's News in Parish. We're just a few miles away in Ellenton, Florida at the Gamble Plantation. So strap onto those seats and grab that popcorn. We're going on a tour.
Well, my name is Ted. On behalf of the State Parks of Florida, I'd like to welcome you here to Gamble Plantation. First of all, I'll give you a brief history as to why Robert Gamble actually came to this area, and then we're going to go ahead and proceed inside the house. Now, there were two different reasons why Robert Gamble came here. First, the end of the Second Seminole War. Secondly, the Armed Occupation Act of 1842. Now, the end of the Second Seminole War had come in 1842, and the Seminole Indians had signed a peace treaty with the United States government. But several of the Seminole Indians were very unhappy that the white man was moving into their territory, so they decided to fight back against it by burning down white homes and white settlements. Well, the Army was very frustrated about this and didn't know what to do, so they went to the United States government and asked for some kind of help. And the government came up with the Armed Occupation Act of 1842, which stated that if you're male, 18 years of age, a United States citizen, and you had a firearm, guns and cannons, you could come down to Florida and get 160 acres of land for free, as long as you stayed for 5 years. Now, their hope for this was going to bring all these armed settlers down to Florida. It was going to form a civilian militia, where they would start fighting against these Seminole Indians and start pushing them further and further down the peninsula of Florida to eventually where the Indians want to leave and go somewhere else. Well, this Armed Occupation Act is what attracted Robert Gamble's attention to this area. He was living up in Tallahassee on his father's sugarcane plantation, but he really wanted to get out on his own and start his own sugarcane plantation. And he thought with 160 acres of free land, this would be a great opportunity for him to get his plantation started, and then he could just build it up from there. So that's what he decided to do. Came down from Tallahassee along the Gulf of Mexico, and he came across the Manatee River. Now, back in Robert's day, he didn't have any cars or trucks or anything like that, so the best and fastest way around was by boat. So you wanted to have your plantation somewhere near a body of water, preferably a river, because a river is just like a roadway coming inland, and the most fertile land is further away from the coast. So when Gamble found the Manatee River, he decided to investigate it, and he got approximately to this point right here. If you look down this road all the way down to the end, you'll see there's some trees and bushes and mangroves down at the end of that road. Well, about 15 feet past that is the Manatee River. And he got to that point in the river and ran his ship aground. He got off his ship onto the northern shore, which is this side, and walked half a mile to we are right here in this general area and decided this is where he wanted to have his plantation. Now, the centerpiece of your plantation is your house, and this is the house that Robert built. It was built in two different sections, the front section and the back section. Now, the back section was built on first, basically to get a house into the ground so he could start planting his crops and accumulating some money. Once he accomplished this, then he started work on this front section of the home that you see right here. And it took him another 5 years to complete. It was completed in late 1850. And one of the things he wanted to put on the front section of this home was some kind of wealthy landowner look. Now, you'll notice that we have columns, 18 of them that go around 3 sides of the house. This particular architectural style is called Greek Revival Vernacular, and it was used by many of the wealthy landowners back in the 1800s. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., many of our government buildings built around that same time period have this same Greek Revival architecture style you see here with the columns. Now, vernacular simply means it was modified to your climate or culture. Up in Washington, their buildings were made out of marble. And we didn't have marble here in Florida, but we did have a substance called Tabby. Now, Tabby is a concrete that is made out of crushed and burned oyster shells, sand, and water. And when you crush and burn those oyster shells, you get lime, and lime is like a glue. It makes things stick together. So it took all that sand and all that shell, and it would bind them all together, and it forms Tabby concrete. All the pillars you see out here, these are all made out of solid Tabby. The walls you see on the house are made of a mixture of red clay, brick, and Tabby. And if you look inside the windows, you can see that the walls are about 2 foot thick. A couple of different reasons for that. One, it keeps the inside of the house cooler during the middle of the summertime with thick walls. 2, we have hurricanes that come through here all the time, so you want to build your house to withstand hurricane force winds. And 3, those Indian attacks. You wanted to build your house to withstand an Indian attack. Well, Robert Gamble lived here for 12 years, from 1844 to 1856. Remember I told you when to build his plantation up? That's exactly what he had done by 1856. He had accumulated 3,500 acres of land and almost 200 slaves. Of course, all that costs money. So he also had accumulated a debt of about $190,000. Also, the Third Seminole War broke out in 1855, which means he had to refortify his entire plantation for the protection against those Seminole Indians. And that, combined with all the money that he owed and several crop failures and falling sugar prices because of exports from Jamaica and Cuba, well, they all finally pushed Gamble over the edge, and he decided that he had had enough. He sold off his entire estate to his creditors for $190,000 and moved back to Tallahassee. Now, when he left here, he took all his furniture with him, so none of the furniture you're going to see inside the house is exact Gamble furniture. It's something from the same time era that we think he would have had, but it's not exact Gamble furniture. Gamble took all his furniture back to Tallahassee with him, put it in a warehouse. 13 hours later, the warehouse burned down to the ground. So we don't have any of Robert Gamble's furnishings left over. But as we're going through the home, I ask that you please make sure not to touch or sit on any of the furniture. If you do need to sit down while we're inside, you can sit down on the windowsills. They do extend throughout most of the house. All right, at this time we're going to head inside.
Let's go.
All right. Come on in. This is the parlor room. This is where Robert Gamble would do his entertaining whenever he would have guests come in, similar to your living room or family room today. You notice a portrait above the piano. That is a portrait of John Grattan Gamble. That was Robert's father. Robert only got 160 acres of land for free. He still needed to have money to get his plantation started for building supplies for his house and his sugar mill, as well as supplies for crops and other things. So he needed to borrow that money from his father, John, who was a banker incidentally, so he loaned out money all the time. The piano that you see right here is a Vos & Sons piano. It was made in Boston in the 1850s. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy, Judah P. Benjamin chapter, the chapter who purchased this home and donated it to the state of Florida in 1927, well, they had a lemonade sale back in 1925 and accumulated $25 in order to pay for this piano from the Salvation Army. Now, just to give you an example of how much this piano is worth today, we just had it restored about 5 years ago. Not the inside section where the strings are or the keys. Just the outside wood sections cost us $3,600, so $25 wasn't too bad of a deal. And if you look right here at this table, you notice an interesting looking box right here. This is known as a tea caddy. Now, tea was very, very expensive back in Robert's day. $50 to $75 a pound for tea. They would ship it from the Far East, who would in turn ship it to Europe and the United States, and everyone would throw their taxes on it, so it got to be very expensive. So you wanted to make sure you kept that tea locked up as much as possible. You'll notice a small keyhole on the front here. You close the top of this up, it would lock. Then you take the entire tea caddy and lock it up in your strong box or your safe. Because anybody could come along and grab some of that tea out of there and stick it in their pocket, then they could sell it on the black market and make a pretty good penny for it. So you had to make sure you kept it locked up. You notice 2 chambers on either side. That's so you can have 2 different styles of teas on either side. And the bowl in the center was actually used to mix and match the tea, so you can make your own style of tea to serve your guests. Well, this is the dining room. You look above the fireplace, you'll see a portrait of Major Robert Gamble, the man who built this house. That was taken in his later years. He was 30 years old when he came here. When Gamble left here in 1856 and went back to Tallahassee, took over his father's sugarcane plantation, became very wealthy. In the 12 years that he lived here, he was a bachelor, was not married, he had no children. He eventually did get married in 1857 after he left here, and he had 2 children. He lived to the age of 92 before he passed away in the year 1906 in Tallahassee. You notice the dining room table here, sideboard over here against the wall, both made out of mahogany from the early 1800s. And usually what would happen is the slaves would bring in the entrees from the kitchen, which is in the back of the house, through this doorway right here, and place the entrees up on the sideboard, similarly in a fashion I'm set up there now. Then they would serve Gamble and his guests who'd be sitting here at the dining room table. And of course, Gamble would always want to have the finest china and crystal set out in order to give that look of a wealthy landowner. Now you'll notice a crescent-shaped dish next to each place setting. That is known as a bone dish. If you had chicken or fish, anything that had bones in it, you wouldn't want to clutter your plate up with those bones. So you take the bones and put them into the bone dish, and the slaves would remove them. That way you wouldn't have to look at those bones while you finish the rest of your dinner. Small round crystal items next to each place setting are known as salt cellars. They'd fill those up with salt. Whenever you wanted to salt an item, just take a pinch of salt and put in whatever needed to be salted, and that would take care of it. Now, when Robert Gamble built this section of the home on, remember the front section is the last section he built on. He wanted to put some kind of air conditioning or cross-ventilation system inside. You'll notice we have windows straight across from each other. You get a good breeze off the Gulf of Mexico, which is out in this direction over here, blows right on through the inside of the house, keeping it a little bit cooler inside. Ceilings in here are 12 foot high, so the heat rises up to the top of the room, keeping the bottom section cooler where we are. And I've already mentioned to you about the 2 foot thick walls keeping it cooler inside. But the shutters on the windows and verandas, those porches that go around 3 sides of the house, they also help to keep it cooler. The shutters help keep the sun from coming inside the house, and the verandas help keep the sun from hitting the sides of the house, helping to keep it cooler in those ways. And if you look between the ceiling and the wall, you notice there's a molding that goes all the way around the room. That is your picture molding. Now remember, the walls are made out of tabby, which is a concrete. So trying to put a nail into that tabby would be virtually impossible without chipping it away. So they take these picture moldings, move about 1/4 inch off the ceiling, go ahead and nail or screw those into the walls because they're not going anywhere. Put hooks in different places where they thought they wanted to have pictures hang down, and they could hang the pictures down along the sides of the walls. And that way, whenever they wanted to move a picture around, they didn't need to worry about spackling up those holes in the walls like we do today. You just slide those hooks back and forth. Pretty good idea.
PJ's Sandwich Shop, a parish landmark since 1984, located in the heart of Parish on US Highway 301. Voted the best sweet tea in town and a local favorite. The folks here bring the highest quality meats, cheeses, and veggies right to your sandwich. Family owned and operated, and serves only locally grown produce and handmade bread. Come in and give us a try or let us cater your event. Delivery is available. PJ's Sandwich Shop. Let's eat fresh right from the farm, not a franchise.
Well, this is Robert Gamble's office. If you look down here on the floor, you notice a floor covering. This is known as a floor cloth. These were usually made out of sailboat canvas. And what they would do is paint, sometimes several times, over the top of that sailboat canvas. And then they would varnish over the top of that, sort of a forerunner to linoleum. And these are very popular floor decorations, as well as being very durable. So if you had a bare floor, more than likely, you'd put one of these floor cloths down over the top of it. You'll notice 2 different styles of desks that we have in here. A stand-up desk here, sit-down desk over there. They can be used in a variety of different ways. If you were working up here at the stand-up desk, next to this adjustable lamp, and you noticed you had too much light, all you'd have to do is just run it up like this. And the candle moving further away actually lessens the light on what you're working on down below. On the other hand, if you need more light, just reverse that pattern, bring it right back down again, and then bring more light closer to what you're working on. Sort of an early form of a dimmer switch. Now, when Robert Gamble came here, this was a very isolated area. The nearest store at that time, 220 miles to the north in St. Marks, Florida, just south of Tallahassee. So they only made 1 trip to the store a month. What in between that trip? Well, they had their own livestock here, and they grew their own crops. Corn, beans, cotton, tobacco, potatoes, rice, citrus, olives, and grapes. Now, all of those I've mentioned to you are just for use here on the plantation. His major cash crop was sugarcane. And one of the items I mentioned to you was tobacco, and that's what I've got right here. This is a plug or twist of chewing tobacco, and they carry these around out in the fields. Whenever they want to take a chaw, just pull it on out, bite a piece off, and start chewing on it. Now, when you're chewing on tobacco, you get tobacco juice, and you have to spit that out, and that's why we have spittoons. One over here underneath this desk, another one over here underneath this table, and you just spit out that tobacco juice into those spittoons. I mentioned tabby to you several times, but we haven't actually seen what tabby looks like. This is tabby concrete. You can see those crushed and burned oyster shells inside there. You get that crushing and burning action on those shells. It makes the lime secrete out of it. You mix in sand and water, it binds it all together, and it forms tabby concrete. Now, all the tabby that you see on this house is original tabby from Robert Gamble's time 160 years ago. and it is the only thing on the house that is original. All the woodwork was replaced when the state of Florida took the property over in 1927. So things like the windows and doors, the frames that go around them, the floors, the ceilings, anything you see on the house that is not made of tabby, such as glass, wood, or metal, was all replaced back in the 1920s, if not later than that. The reason being, well, they actually used the house to store fertilizer in for several years before the state of Florida took it over. That ate through all the original wood. Gamble had 2 sugar mills. His first sugar mill burned down in 1849. It was made out of all cypress wood, got caught on fire by a lightning strike, and it burned down to the ground rather easily. So he decided to build his second sugar mill, which is the one in the picture right here. He wanted to build a little bit more fireproof than that first sugar mill, so he built it out of that tabby brick. You notice the brick walls along the sides and the brick chimneys up on top, and they make it a lot more fireproof than that first sugar mill ever was. But something else he wanted to do with this sugar mill was to make it the most modern sugar mill in Florida. So he went to England and bought 2 steam engines and brought them down to Florida and used one of those steam engines to pump water out to the sugar mill, which was about a half-mile behind the house here. And he used the other steam engine to actually run the boilers inside the sugar mill. And here's a good example of the machinery inside Gamble's mill right here. Now, Gamble would take the sugar cane out of the fields and put it through something called a cane press, which would crush and squeeze that sugar cane to get cane juice out of it. They'd collect up all the cane juice and put them inside the boilers, which are right over here, and they'd boil it till they got it to a certain thickness when the water had evaporated out of it. They'd take that thickened cane juice out of the boilers, put it into hogshead barrels, put those barrels up for about 20 or 30 days, and let them just drain through the cracks. And whatever drained out of those barrels was syrup or molasses, which they could sell as a byproduct, and whatever's left over inside the barrels was the raw sugar. Now they leave the sugar in the barrels, cork the barrels up, put the barrels on a ship, and ship them off to New Orleans, which was the major sugar market back in the 1800s. And to get a good example of all of Robert Gamble's land holdings, I do have a map over here on this wall. All the green shaded areas you see on this map were all of Gamble's land holdings, 3,500 acres in all. You notice a lighter shade of green and a darker shade of green. The lighter shade of green were areas that were cleared out. The darker shade were areas that were uncleared. You have to remember he was only here for 12 years. And he had 3,500 acres of land to clear out all by hand, no cranes or bulldozers like we have today. So consequently, he never got all 3,500 acres of land cleared out. It just would have taken him too long to do. Eventually, he did get 1,500 acres of land cleared out before he left here in 1856. This is the workroom, and you had 3 different classifications of slaves in Robert's day. You had your field hands who worked out in the fields, harvesting, planting, clearing your property out. Then your second class of slave were your skilled labor slave. That was any slave that had a skill Robert could use to build his plantation up. If you look over against the wall, you see the cobbler's bench. Of course, shoemaking is a skill. Blacksmith, carpenter, wheelwright, cooper, anyone who had a skill Robert could use to build his plantation up, he would use as skilled labor slave. And then your top class of slave were your household slaves. That was any slave that worked inside the house, either in here ironing or sewing, working inside the kitchen preparing the meals, or working inside the main house being a butler or maid. Now I mentioned ironing to you, this type of iron that they would use right here. The top of this comes off of here and you fill the bottom section up with hot ash and coal from the fireplace. Place this top back on and lock it, and then go ahead and iron. Now this weighs about 15 pounds when it's fully loaded up, so you can imagine using this for 7 or 8 hours a day. They also made lye soaps, in which you see here, out of animal lard and ash. They would take the ash and pour water through it to get the lye out of it, take the lye and mix it into the animal fat and cook it to get the excess water out of it, take out what's left over, cut into slices and let it cool off, and you have lye soap left over. Now back in Gamble's day, they used lye soap for all sorts of different things, skin diseases and things like that, but you had to be careful with this lye soap because remember, it's pretty strong stuff. You could actually take this lye soap and scrub it on your skin. It'd actually take the top layer of skin off if you weren't careful with it, so you had to be very careful with that lye soap. This item right here is a candlestick. If you came into a room that was dark and you didn't have any candles or lamps, you could take a piece of kindling wood, either pine or cypress, clip it on here and light up the other end, and it would light up the room quite nicely. And they also made candles here out of bayberry wax. You get a big vat of that bayberry wax together and cook it to get the excess water out of it. And then they would use something called the stick and wick method, where they would tie the wicks onto a stick, similar to what you see here, and they just dip them into the wax, pull them out, let them dry, dip them in again, pull them out, let them dry. And you could do that as many times as you wanted to a certain thickness of candle that you wanted. Now eventually they came up with candle molds, as you see over here against the wall, which make it a lot easier and faster to make candles. But they still use this method for specialty candles because you can make any desired thickness you wanted to with this method, and with that, you can only make one, tall and thin. Over in the corner, you see a good example of a bathtub. Gamble would have his slaves carry the bathtub upstairs into his bedroom. Then they bring buckets of water up, usually heated first, and pour them into the bathtub as Gamble was taking his bath. Now, taking a bath was a family affair because one family used one thing of bath water. Usually the man of the house took the bath first, then the lady of the house secondly, then any children you had third, fourth, and fifth. So if you were the youngest one in your family, well, that meant that you went last and you got everybody else's dirty and cold bath water. Now, I'm talking about some dirty water. It's pretty dirty too because basically you'd only take a bath once a week, whether you needed to or not. Usually by that time you needed to. That's also where you get the term, don't throw the baby out with the bath water from. Always the last one to go in. Over in this corner, you see a good example of cotton on the branch. They did grow cotton here on the plantation just for use here on the plantation. They would take the cotton off the branch here and use these items right here called cards. These were used to stretch the cotton out and get the seeds out of it. Of course, this was before the cotton gin was invented. Once you'd accomplish that, then you run the yarn off onto the spinning wheel into yarn, and then you go ahead and weave it and mold it into any type of thread that you would want. Once you got that done, you'd use this item right here. This is called a weasel. This is used to measure the yarn or the thread. Nothing ever went to waste here on the plantation. You always wanted to know exactly how much you had of everything, and that's the reason for this. It'd go around 50 times before the counter, which is in the square box, go ahead and click off, making the small button on top pop up, making a popping sound. Of course, that's where you get the term, pop goes the weasel from, right there.
Hi, I'm Jean Dalton, licensed massage therapist and owner and operator of Expert Massage Therapy, conveniently located near the Ellenton Outlet Mall, 7216 Highway 301 North in Ellenton. Call for an appointment, 941-448-1408. Why live in pain when you can have affordable massage? $45 for 1 hour, $25 for a half hour. And personal injury protection insurance accepted.
Well, this little breezeway we just walked down had a couple different names. One was called a whistle walk, the other was a dog trot. And we're about ready to enter the kitchen area here, and the dining room is way over on the other side of the house. So when the slaves are taking the food from the kitchen over to the dining room, mind you, we're talking about 10, 11-year-old slave boys who love to taste the food. Well, they had to whistle. That way they knew they weren't eating the food on the way over there. So they call this a whistle walk. Now, dog trot, they always had the kitchen separated from the rest of the house. The reason being is they had a fire going in the kitchen all the time, which would make this the hottest room in the house. Remember, you're trying to keep the rest of the house cooler, so you separate the two. In this area here, this is where the dogs like to congregate. You feel that little breeze blowing through here, you know why. And also didn't hurt too much. The kitchen was here. They get little scraps out of the kitchen. And a lot of times those dogs are making a nuisance out of themselves trying to get scraps out of the kitchen. So the kitchen staff would fry up little pieces of cornbread and throw them out over here, and the dogs would run over there and they'd sit down and eat those pieces of cornbread. Of course, those pieces of cornbread were called hush puppies. That's where we get hush puppies today. It would hush the puppies and keep them quiet. Well, this is the kitchen. If you look over here, you notice a fairly large fireplace. It is the largest fireplace in the entire house, and for good reason. They did all their cooking right here in this fireplace, and you usually had a fire going in there all the time. With that fire going in there all the time like that, you'd have hot ash cover the entire length of the bottom of this fireplace, and you could actually use that hot ash to cook on. Now, one of the things you notice missing in here is an oven. How would you bake things like pies, cakes, and breads? We'd use this pan right here. This is known as a spider pan, and this was used to bake with. Now, say to make some cornbread. You take the cornmeal and the flour to the dry storage area right over here and make it into a dough. Take that dough and put it inside the spider pan, put this top back on, then take the entire pan and put it in the fireplace and bury it up in that hot ash. And you'd be cooking from the bottom and the top evenly, just like an oven does. And that's how you bake your pies, cakes, and breads. This item right here is a coffee bean roaster. They did not grow coffee here on the plantation. They had to buy it in bulk when they went to the store once a month. And they bought their beans raw and unroasted. And here's a good example of raw and roasted coffee beans here. You would take those raw beans and put them into the roaster, take the roaster, put it into the fire, and turn the handle on it. That way you'd roast the beans without burning them. Pull them out. Now you have roasted beans you can see here. Take those roasted beans, put them on top of the coffee grinder here. Close this up, turn the wheel and grind them up, and you have freshly ground coffee down below. Small white dish you see right here is known as a pap dish. This was used to feed infants. They didn't have bottles back in those days, so they would use the pap dish to feed the infants their milk, formula, or mash to food. Now another thing you notice missing in here is a refrigerator. How did they keep things cool, like eggs, cream, and milk? I'm going to come over here in this corner and I'll show you. They would take the items they wanted to keep cool and place them into mason jars or crock pots similar to the one you see here. Put a top on it, tie a rope around the top section of it, and throw it into the water cistern. The temperature of the water in the cistern was cooler than the air temperature, so keep it cooler over there in the water cistern than it would if they tried to store it inside the kitchen. This item right here is a pie safe. This is used to store and cool food. The air could circulate through the tiny holes here, cooling out the food inside, but the bugs couldn't get inside because these holes are just too small to get themselves stuck before they got into your food. And this item is the dry sink area. They do not have running water inside the house. They bring in buckets of water from the water cistern, place them in like so, and then wash hands or dishes right out of the bucket. Any water that would spill out of the bucket would spill into the dry sink area here and not onto the floors. And when you're finished, sop up all that water out of the dry sink area, squeeze it back into the bucket, take that bucket of dirty water around the back side of the house and water your gardens with it. This item right here is a candle holder. If you're walking out the door and it was dark outside, just reach inside here and grab a candle out, light it up in the fireplace, place in a lantern. You could walk right out the doorway into the darkness. And we do have a cutout here in the wall so you can see the original wall that Robert Gamble put down 160 years ago. You can see those tabby bricks in there as well as a thin layer of tabby plaster over the top of that. Then they'd whitewash over the top of that. The entire house was white because white reflects the heat away from the house. The state of Florida has since put plasterboard over the top of the original wall to protect it from any further decay that it might get. Well, this is Robert's water cistern. Now, Gamble was very concerned about the water when he got here. He knew that the groundwater had all sorts of disease and dysentery in it. Slaves couldn't work if they were sick all the time, plus had a funny sulfur taste to it. So he decided not to use that groundwater. He wanted to use rainwater. You look over here, you notice there's a downspout that comes off the top of the house and it goes right into the other end of that water cistern. Now the cistern is made of tabby, as you can see here, and it holds about 40,000 gallons of water. And it's tipped slightly so that the water will work its way from one end of the cistern down there to this end right here where the bucket is. And if you look inside here, you can actually see there's a thin wall of tabby, 6 to 8 inches wide, going right down the middle of the water cistern. Now remember, tabby is made out of crushed and burned oyster shells, which forms lime, and limestone is a natural water purifier. So the water would actually work its way through that thin tabby wall, purifying itself as it did so. No need to boil the water. Now the only problem he has is mosquitoes. They get into the water and lay their eggs in there, say a mosquito larva floating around in your drinking water. So he went ahead and put minnows in there, little fish. The minnows would eat the mosquito larva out of the water as well as the algae to keep it from stagnating. So all you had to worry about when you brought your bucket up was that you didn't have a fish in it, and that was it. Plantation bell behind you there was used as a communication feature for the slaves out in the fields. If you had a fire or an in-attack here at the house, you'd ring the bell. Slaves would hear the bell ringing out in the fields and knew they had to come into the house to be communicated to or to help out. Well, if you look out across the lawn, you see there are two stones out there. Those are not gravestones, they are memorial markers. The one over on the left side is World War I soldiers who lost their lives during that war. The one on the right side is to Confederate soldiers who lost their lives during the war between the states. Those were both put up in 1937 by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. You notice a white picket fence in behind the stones. On the other side of that fence, there are 4 pits that go down into the ground. That's where we believe the old smoke pit area was, where they would smoke the meat and then store it underground to keep it fresh. Building on the left over here is the Archives building for the United Daughters of the Confederacy. It is a modern building, so there's really nothing to see in there. And the building over on the right here is the Patton House. Now, when Gamble left here in 1856, The creditors, Cofield and Davis of New Orleans, came in here and took the property over and sold off anything that wasn't nailed down. Well, in 1861, the war between the states broke out. Confederate government came in here and took the property over and used it to grow crops for the Confederate Army. When the war was over in 1865, the property was given back to those same creditors, but all that was left was the house and 3,500 acres of land. The sugar mill had been blown up during the war, so it was no longer working sugar operations, so the creditors decided to sell off the property. And in 1873, they sold it to a man named George Patton for $3,000 in back tax, and by the way, no relationship to General George Patton. It's spelled differently. Now, George came and lived in this house about 20 years until 1893 when he passed away, and the property was given over to his youngest son, Dudley, who had absolutely no intention of living in this house. It was 50 years old by then, had none of the modern conveniences they were starting to get around the turn of the century, and it was very expensive to update this house. So he decided to build himself a new home. And that's the home he built right out there. It is the Patton House, completed in 1895, and since 1895 no one has lived in this house. It was used as a warehouse for about 30 years until the 1920s, when the United Daughters of the Confederacy purchased the home and donated it to the state of Florida in 1927. We've used it as a state park ever since. Judah P. Benjamin was the Secretary of State of the Confederacy. And in 1865, when the Confederacy was defeated, a price was put on the head of all the Confederate leaders because they were held accountable for all loss of life during the war between the states. So you had one of two options at that particular point. You could either go into hiding and try and get out of the country, or you could turn yourself in and be hung, shot, or imprisoned for the rest of your life. Of course, most of them went into hiding. And this bed we're about ready to enter into is the last hiding place that Judah P. Benjamin used before he left for England. Now, if you think about it, this is a good place to hide because at that time this entire area all the way around the house here was completely cleared out of all trees and vegetation. It was just a sand-swept area that went out for several yards that Gamble used a fire break in case his fields ever caught on fire. His house wouldn't burn down with that sand-swept area going all the way around it. Well, Gamble had it cleared out all the way down to the Manatee River. So all these trees and the road and the houses you see out here across the street were all non-existent back in those days. So you could actually come right out here and look out and see about half of the Manatee River from right here. If there are any Union gunboats coming down the river, you'd be able to see them from here long before they knew you were in this area, and you could go find another hiding place several miles away where they would not be able to find you. Well, after being here for 3 days, Mr. Benjamin decided he wanted to move on. You don't want to stay in one place for too long, especially when you have a $40,000 bounty on your head. So he got in touch with a man named Captain Tresca, who owned a boat down in the Sarasota Bay just south of us here. Captain Tresca, along with Captain Curry, came down the Manatee River under the cover of darkness, picked up Mr. Benjamin at the river's edge, took him down around the coast of Florida to the Bahamas. From there he went on to Cuba, and from Cuba he went on to England. Once he got to England, he studied English law and became a barrister, and eventually worked his way up to be a counselor on Queen Victoria's court before he passed away in the year 1884 in Paris. So this is the room that Mr. Benjamin used as his hiding place while he stayed here at Gamble Plantation. All right, let's head inside.
Parish Professionals Networking Group, a true source of business referrals. Discover Parish. Live, work, and play in the heart of Tampa Bay.
Join Parish Professionals today!
Well, this is the Judah P. Benjamin bedroom. You look above the fireplace, you'll see a picture of Judah P. Benjamin. That was taken when he was a senator from Louisiana back in the 1850s before the war broke out. Another picture of Mr. Benjamin over on this wall, taken when he was a counselor on Queen Victoria's court. And the two gentlemen in the corner here, the bottom one is Captain Tresca, top one is Sergeant McLeod. Those were the two men who risked their lives to take Mr. Benjamin to England. Now, I mentioned mosquitoes to you downstairs. They were a big problem in those days. And if you look at these windows, you'll notice there's no screening on the windows, which means those mosquitoes could come in and out of the windows as freely as you and I walking out the door. And you had to protect yourselves from mosquitoes. They still carry things like malaria and yellow fever, and you didn't want to get that. So one of the ways they protect themselves from mosquitoes were four-poster beds. They had mosquito netting they draped down along the sides, keeping the mosquitoes from getting to them while they slept at night. And they also wore long sleepwear, you see here, covering their arms, legs, and neck to make sure those mosquitoes did not bite them. The bed that you see right here is a feather bed. If you ever slept on a feather bed, you know they can be very lumpy and that's uncomfortable to your back and neck. So they usually sent the slaves up an hour before bedtime with one of these. It's called a paddle or plumper. And the slaves would use these on the beds for about 30 to 45 minutes per bed, flattening and plumping the beds up so you could sleep on it comfortably that evening. And the table is here because remember, Mr. Benjamin is in hiding. He doesn't want to be seen outside too much for fear that someone might recognize who he was. At the time that he's traveling through this area, he's traveling under an alias, a Mr. Howard from South Carolina, who's looking for land to buy down here in Florida after the war between the states. Well, the Confederate government owned this property at this time and they had a caretaker here. His name was Archibald McNeil, and Mr. McNeil was very familiar with Mr. Benjamin and met him several times. So Mr. Benjamin came knocking on his door. He said, "You go ahead, stay here in my home until we can find you a boat out of the country." And that's exactly what he did. He stayed in this room, had his meals served up here, his tea was served up here. He also did a lot of writing and reading up here in this room as well. And over in this corner you see an armoire wardrobe. When Gamble built this house, you were taxed into how many rooms you had in the house. If you built a closet into the side of the wall like we do today, that'd be classified as an additional room and you would have to pay additional taxes on it. So they didn't build closets into the walls. They brought up armoires or wardrobes similar to what you see here, and of course these are furniture, so you don't need to pay any extra taxes on them and you would save some money. Well, this is the Gamble bedroom. You look over here on this wall, you see a picture of Major Robert Gamble taken in his later years. Picture above the fireplace, a picture of General Robert E. Lee, the leader of the Confederate Army. The bed that you see right here next to me is known as a rope bed. Gets its name from the ropes you see that go along the bottom section. You're holding the mattress up. With sleeping on it, with humidity, those ropes would tend to sag a little bit, which your mattress would tend to sag a little bit. And you don't want to sleep on a sagging mattress. So you come around over here with a key, which is a long pole. Stick that key into this hole right here and push down on it. That would tighten these ropes up, firming your mattress up. And once you got those ropes into that tightened position, there are two ratchets on either side of the bed that would hold those ropes in that tightened position. And that's where you get the saying, sleep tight from, sleeping on tight ropes. This armor here is a bedroll. If you ever got cold in the middle of the night, just reach out and grab your bedroll and roll it out on top of yourself and you would be nice and warm underneath it. And they didn't have the modern conveniences you and I have today. If you go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, you could go all the way across the lawn to the outhouse, which could be fun on cold and rainy mornings. Or you would have one of these. Square wooden one is known as a thunderbox. The one right next is known as a slop jar honey pot, or some people call it a chamber pot. You would just do what you needed to do in the middle of the night, and the household slaves would come clean it up the next morning. Definitely makes you appreciate what you got today. Well, this is the storage and dressing room area. You notice the bed over here against the wall. This is known as a day bed. This is used by ladies mainly in the afternoon after lunchtime. They come up here and take their naps on this day bed. And you notice how thin the bed is. There's a reason for that. Sometimes ladies want to take their naps out on the veranda where there's a nice cool breeze. So they made the beds thin enough where they would fit right through the doorways. Take them out on the verandas and take their naps outside in the cool breeze. The flag you see above the bed is an actual Confederate flag that was captured by General Sherman's army on its way down through to Atlanta. The Sherman family eventually donated the flag to our United Daughters chapter in 1939, and we've had it in here ever since. And we also have various pictures of the estate during the 20th century over here against this wall. We had a hurricane that came through this area in 1926 and it devastated the house. If you look out the window here, you see there's a column out there. That column was actually blown right out the side of the house during that 1926 hurricane. And I have a picture of it right over here. Top left-hand corner, storm 1926. You can actually see that column blown right out the side of the house. Also had a hurricane in 1935 that came through here, blew off the brand new roof the state of Florida just put on. That's the new roof laying all over the ground there next to the mansion. And you have to remember when the state of Florida took the property over 1927, the house had been used to store fertilizer for several years. So the state of Florida came in here and took a picture of the property. I have that picture right here. Before restoration, 1927. As you can see, the house is not in very good condition. So the state of Florida took the next 11 years restoring the house. So you can see what it looks like today, what it would have looked like back in the mid-1800s.